So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. Chapter 5. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 4.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we ended with this first family not really doing that well. Their first son, Cain, in who they had put all their hope, he murdered the second son, Abel. And so basically, Adam and Eve, they lost both of their sons. They lost Cain to wandering, and then they lost Abel to death. And so it wasn't really a real good start for man. There was a lot of heartache. And so now we have Cain, and he's living in the land of Nod, which means wandering. And although he's supposed to be a vagabond, he doesn't really obey God's command here, and he builds a city. And he names this city after who he thinks is going to be his great hope, who's going to be his legacy. And he names the city Enoch after his son. And the name Enoch means consecrated. But here what we have is we have the story of two totally different families. And this is two lines that stem from Adam and Eve. We have this worldly, ungodly line of Cain, and then we have this righteous, godly line of Seth. And this line of Cain, which is worldly, it's built on the pride of men. And in this line of Seth, well, it's built on the line of promise, that seed of Eve would come, where the Messiah would come through. And the first family line that the Bible deals with is this line of Cain. And the Bible doesn't follow Cain's line very long. Even though Cain, he was a murderer, I wouldn't go and assume that everybody in his line was any more evil than the people in the line of Seth. And the other way, that all those in the line of Seth were any more godly than some of the people in the line of Cain, because they were all fallen. And we see that from the very beginning that this corruption is inherited into all men, and it affects all of us. And with these two lines given, we can see a lot of similarities and we can see a lot of differences. And one of the similarities that we see right off the bat is the names. In Cain's line and in Seth's line, they both have children with the name Enoch, and they both have children with the name Lamech. And then the other names that are mentioned, they're very, very similar with very similar spellings. And as we go through Cain's line, it never mentions how long anybody lives. But what is mentioned is some of their wives. In Seth's line, it never mentions anyone's wife, but we have the ages of how old the men were when they had their child that would be in the line. And then we have how long that man actually lived. And even in Seth's line, it doesn't follow all the descendants. It only follows one line of descendants because it's only going to follow the people that lead to Noah. And that's because that's the line that'll lead to Christ. And that's also our line. We all came from Noah, and we came from his children. And the first person that we find that's of interest in this line of Cain is this man named Lamech. And Lamech, he's the very first bigamist. He was a polygamist. He had more than one wife. He had two wives, which was never an intent for man. And we know this because of the command that God had given to Adam and Eve about becoming one flesh. But even though God had given that command, we see throughout the Bible that God allowed it, but it was never his intent. And he reinforces one man, one wife throughout the whole Bible. And you can read that about elders in the church even, that they weren't supposed to be polygamous because polygamy was still, around during the days of Jesus and the days of Paul. And you can kind of see what Lamech thought was valuable by the names of his wives. His first wife, Ada, she means pleasure. That's what her name means, or beauty. And that kind of leads us to believe that Ada was probably some kind of trophy wife. And through this Ada, she had 2 very prosperous children. And then through his other wife, he had 1 prosperous child. And the first one was Jabal. And it says that he was the father of those who live in tents and who have livestock. And so in our modern world, we would call him a builder. He'd be a builder of homes, he'd be a builder of communities, and he would also be considered a developer of agriculture. And so you can see that his life probably had a lot to do with commerce and markets and marketing. It was business. And then you have Jubal, which was Jabal's brother. And this is the first beginning of that we see of cute names, where people would name their kids with these silly names. Jubal and Jabal, why don't you come here? It's time for dinner. Jubal, Jabal. But Jubal, he basically was the father or the leader of those in the entertainment industry, because it says he was the father of all those who played harps and flutes. So I kind of see him as kind of a Quincy Jones of his day. And then through Zillah, he had a son named Tubal-Cain. And he was kind of a leader of industry and manufacturing, because he was an instructor in craftsmen in bronze and in iron. And so you can see he would have been a manufacturer of machinery and of weapons. And all 3 of these sons are leaders in the world. And those are the same areas that our world, that we esteem really highly. They're the things that deal with wealth, they deal with economy, and they deal with prosperity. And there's no way we should really ever think of these people of being some kind of primitive man or some kind of caveman. They weren't people less developed than ourselves. They were probably smarter than us. One reason is because they lived longer. They had a lot more time to learn things. And their genes haven't deteriorated. The DNA was much more pure back then. But there's one thing you really don't see in Lamech's life, and you don't see a spiritual life. You don't see any calling on the name of God. And we realize that Cain, the father of all these kids, that he walked away from God. And he didn't lead his family into the things of God. And that's because you can't really lead people into things that you don't have yourself. So if you want to have a godly family, then you need to be godly. All right, so we have this guy, his name's Lamech. He's a bigamist. He has 3 prosperous sons in the world. And then we find out that he's a murderer. And he's just like his great-great-grandfather Cain, except that Lamech, he kills 2 men, and he says it was for hurting them. But his logic is twisted, because he knows the story of Cain, but he believes that Cain was avenged for his murdering. And so he says that he should be avenged 7 times more than Cain, because he killed 2 men. And so we end this line of Lamech, and now we go back to these broken-hearted people, Adam and Eve, and they're probably pretty disappointed with Cain and his family. And now they're going to have another son. And this son, Eve names Seth. And Seth means appointed. And Eve's the one who tells us, hey, this is Abel's replacement. Because she realizes now that promised seed was not going to come through Cain, and it wasn't going to come through Cain's line, which she originally hoped. But Eve is still placing her faith in God's promise, but now she's placing it through this son, Seth. And she's absolutely right. And you have to realize these parents had a lot of heartache with their children. They didn't have a really easy life since the fall. And we find that we share these same kinds of heartaches. And if we don't personally, we know families that have these same kind of heartaches where they lose children and they lose children to the world and things don't quite turn out, that they had a lot of hope, but all those hopes were dashed. Things started out pretty good and they kind of turned. And so now we start chapter 4, and it says that men start to call on the name of the Lord. And that name there for the Lord again here is Yahweh. So they're calling on the real God. And you kind of have to wonder, well, why did they ever stop? They're so close to the beginning. Adam and Eve have been around. They must have heard the stories. And we're reminded that Adam, that he himself, that he was made in the likeness of God. But then it tells us that his children aren't, that they're made in his likeness, that they're in the likeness of Adam. And what that means is that Adam's children were fallen. Because if you remember when we talked about Adam being made in the likeness of God, we weren't talking that he was physically made like God, but that he was spiritually made like God. Because Adam's body, it was just made of dirt, like our bodies are made of dirt. And so the spiritual likeness of Adam's children, they were made in the spiritual fallen nature, just like Adam. And that's the way it's been through all humanity. We've all been fallen. And we can see that nature passed on and passed on and passed on until you get to the birth of Jesus. And then again, Jesus is in the likeness of God. And that's because Jesus is God. Okay, so we look at these pre-flood days, and we look at these long lives where people lived for almost 1,000 years, but there were two exceptions. And one of the exceptions was Seth's Enoch, who only lived for 365 years, but he didn't die, he was taken. And then we have Lamech, also from Seth, which was Noah's dad, and he only lived to 777 years, but he also died before the flood. And before the flood, everything was different. Like we mentioned, that there was a barrier in the sky that probably filtered out a lot of the cosmic rays and the radiation. And it's believed that the earth probably wasn't tilted on its axis back then, and there was probably only a 360-day year. But at that time of the flood, that there were dramatic changes in the earth, but the only thing that didn't change was man's wickedness. That stayed the same. And because of the long lifespans, some have calculated that there could have been up to 7 billion people on the earth before the flood. And we're also told that Adam had other sons and daughters, but here we're only interested still in only one line, and that's that line that leads to Christ. And so now, as we follow this line from Seth to Noah, we're told the age of every man when he fathers the next person in the line, and then we're also told the age of when he dies until we get to Noah. And we're told that Seth lived 912, and Enosh 905, Canaan 910, Mahalalel 895, Jared 962, and then Enoch was only 365. And until we read up to Enoch, we read, they all died. And that's what it's been since Adam. It's been a long chain of death. People are born, people die. People are born, people are die. It's a parade of death. And that's how it's going to be till the world's all finished. Except here with this son named Enoch. And here's the first time we have a man that didn't die. And it says that he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. And it also tells us here, and it's kind of interesting, that it wasn't until Methuselah was born that Enoch walked with God. His first 65 years of life, he didn't walk with God. But after Methuselah, he walked with God. And that's like a lot of us. We have that one child that just makes us want to walk with God a little closer than we did. And what walking with God meant was that Enoch, he had a true, meaningful relationship. He had a deep relationship, and he had fellowship. And you look at Methuselah's name, and it may have had something to do with that. Because what Methuselah's name means is, when he is dead, it shall come. And what that's speaking about is God's judgment, which at that time was the flood. So God revealing this truth to Enoch, now he walks with God in a deep relationship. And he does that for 300 years. And then it says God takes him. And he takes him without dying. And a lot of people say he translated him or he raptured him. And in the history of the Bible, there's only recorded 2 men that have been taken to heaven without dying. And one of them is here, is Enoch. And the other one is Elijah the prophet. And we read about that in 2 Kings. And some people believe that those are the 2 people that will come back in the end times because they didn't die and it's appointed for men to die once. Some people think it's going to be Enoch and Elijah. Other people think it's going to be Moses and Elijah and Zerubbabel. And, there's different thoughts. But I do believe that here Enoch is written about and him being taken and that being made a big deal is because Enoch is given to us as a type of the Christian church, that those who walk in a deep relationship with God, and here Enoch, he's being taken out of the world to heaven to be with God before the judgment is poured out on the earth, because God isn't going to pour out his judgment on those who walk in a deep way with him. And in that day, it meant the flood. And in the same way, I believe that God is going to take his church. He's going to take the Christian church, those who walk deeply with God, he's going to take them out of the world before his second judgment, that judgment of the 7 years of tribulation. But that, just like Enoch, the church will be raptured and it'll be escaping God's wrath because God doesn't appoint his own children to go through his wrath. We get the wrath from the world. We get the tribulations and the troubles of the world like everybody else. But God loves us and he doesn't pour out his wrath on us. And so just like Enoch is a type of the church, Noah is considered to be a type of Israel, where Noah and his family, they did not escape the judgment, but that they were carried through the judgment. And that's what we read about in the book of Revelation, of how Israel is taken and carried through this wrath of God, how God protects them and brings them through it to the other side. So now we can see how patient God is with man when we look at Methuselah's life, because Methuselah lived for 969 years. He lived almost 1,000 years. When it was told that God was going to judge the world, he still waited another 1,000 years. Because God, in his nature, he doesn't want anyone to perish. He was waiting for men to repent and to come. And so now this Methuselah, he has a son, and his son is Lamech. It's not the same as Cain's Lamech. It's a different Lamech. And he actually dies before his father, Methuselah. But during Lamech's life, he had a son, and he named him Noah. And Noah, we read here, means comfort, but it also means rest. And if you do the math and you figure it out, and I didn't do the math, I just read somebody who did do the math, Noah would have been about 14 years old when Seth died, the son of Adam. He would have been 14. And his father, Lamech, he would have been 56 years old when Adam died. So all these people that we read here, because of these long lifespans, they were very, very close to the beginning. And so now at 500 years old, we're told that Noah, he has his firstborn son, Japheth. And in our Bibles, it has the order different, and it has Shem first. And it's only because Shem is the line of promise. But the order of the children was Japheth, and then it was Shem, and then it was Ham. And there's one thing. If you're going to name your kid Ham, you probably should name one of the other kids Bacon, because people would like him a lot better if his name was Bacon than Ham. And now it gives us this little break from these genealogies. And we get to look at how corrupted the people had become in this short time. And we see how Jesus even compares the last days, which I believe are our days, the same way. And he compares it to the wickedness that they had back then in their last times as the times of Noah. And how even with the world going toward judgment and being wicked, but that people are only concerned with their daily lives. They were concerned with their drinking, and they were concerned about their relationships and their marriages and the marriages of their kids and what they were going to eat. They were only concerned with their pleasures. And so we see that chapter 6 begins with a population explosion. And if you look at even our own times, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 1.6 billion people on the earth. And in 100 years, in the year 2000, we have over 6 billion people on the earth. And like we mentioned before, with the longevity of life back then, they could have easily have had 7 billion people. And so it doesn't mean it was that much different than our times as far as how many people on the planet. And we don't know how modern they were or how they had become because we have no records of anything before the flood. But they weren't primitive, and they weren't cavemen. They had to have been a great society in a worldly sense, but they weren't a great society in a spiritual sense. Because what we see in chapter 6 is we see a lot of demonic activity. And there are 3 basic views of what we're looking at here, of these sons of God with the daughters of men. And the first view is a totally natural-looking view, and it's probably the most popular view of the evangelical church. There it's saying that the sons of God, all it means is that they're talking about the sons of Seth, the godly line of Seth, that they were the sons of God, the godly line, the one that we've been reading about. And they're talking about the sons of God marrying these beautiful women from the line of Cain, the ungodly line of Cain. And this thought is that they were corrupting the pure line of Seth, and that there would be no one for the Messiah to be able to come through. And even though there's a lot of Christians who adhere to this view, I have a couple problems with it. How does the mixing the line of Cain and Seth produce giants? And like I said before, I wouldn't presume that all the line of Seth were godly and a lot more godly than Cain's line, because all people were fallen. And if you look at that, Adam and Eve, they had other sons and daughters. There's other lines. They're only talking about 2 lines, but there were a lot of lines from Adam and Eve. And the other part is that both lines basically all died in the flood. There were only 8 people saved in that flood.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,